As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
This is such a BS cop-out answer. And look, it's nice for you to sit there and say, oh, well, we have to make sure that it's not U.S. troops. We're just going to prop up Ukraine. We're just going to send them weapons and money. It's like, oh, okay. That's easy to say until something happens where you get drawn into it. And by the way, we've already figured out from leaks, not from them telling us, that there are NATO troops that are already in Ukraine. They may not be on the front lines doing the fighting, but they're there. And this really starts to muddy the waters. You can just imagine so many different scenarios where then maybe if you keep flirting with this war, there's no choice but to get U.S. troops in there. Tim Scott's deep thoughts. The post-World War II rules-based order comes from, what did he say? Our Judeo-Christian values or something like it's Jesus, basically. The American empire, you understand, that's just Jesus. The U.S. dominance over the world that's just what Jesus wants. That's always what he wrote about. It's just our Christianity and our goodness and how we follow rules. In reality, what they call the rules-based international order, which basically means American empire, American hegemony, America running the show, what it comes from, objectively, is us dropping 2 nuclear bombs on Japan and then being like, we are the only country in the world that has nukes and we're ready to use them. Now we run the show. And this rules-based order doesn't really apply to us. There are rules. We don't follow them. I mean, there's tons of examples of that. Every single war of the last 20 years, America has violated the rules and the rules-based order. Back in the 90s, Bill Clinton wanted to go to war in Serbia to break off Kosovo, and he couldn't get a UN resolution for it, which is what the rules of the rules-based order say you need, because Russia was on the Security Council, and they could veto it, and so they couldn't get it. So he just did it anyway. He just used NATO and did it anyway. That's the rules-based order. That we don't follow any rules, and it damn sure doesn't come from Jesus. Playing, she's just saying her thing. She's like, we have to have a strong military and be energy independent, and that's what blah 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 blah. And he's like, yeah, who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline? Yeah, okay. And you can just see how uncomfortable she is and how much she doesn't want to answer the question. And he's just like, yeah, no, it was clearly backed by the Biden administration, right? So what is this? And Tucker is bringing up, first of all, an act of war against a NATO ally, one of, if not the biggest environmental terrorist acts in human history. And Nikki Haley's like, oh, okay, let's talk about a bag of cocaine found at the White House. That's her critique. What a fundamentally unserious person. Tucker makes the best point there. You're like, and it really kind of exposes the whole game. Where Tucker's like, well, okay, so if the Biden administration did this and you're running against that administration, why wouldn't you play that card? Why not point out, hey, it seems like you guys either committed or certainly at least backed a major act of terrorism against one of our closest allies. That's a pretty good thing to run against him on. And yet they have no interest in doing that. And doesn't that kind of expose the whole thing? That's the whole game right there, is that they're not actually running against the Biden administration. That's not how this political system works. Democrats aren't really running against Republicans. Republicans aren't really running against Democrats. They're all participating in this show to preserve the status quo. That's how it really works. It's all kind of this game where the elite get what they want no matter who wins. And so, no, it doesn't actually, if that's the case, then you wouldn't really want to run against the Biden administration on that, because then you're kind of exposing how truly sick and evil forces are running our government. If you're in the game of beating that side, then you probably would want to expose that. But if you're in the game of actually protecting those forces, then you'd want to dance around it and talk about a bag of cocaine. DeSantis survived. He did okay later on. He had portions. He came out very strong against central bank digital currency. Had some good positions. I don't know how much we can trust him. I mean, I operate under the assumption that you can't trust anybody who's running for office. The problem is just when your criticism of the wars are, so when he talks about the war in Iraq, and he's talking about how, the mission kept changing. And so that's the problem with the war in Iraq, is that the mission kept changing. And so we have to have a clear, concrete mission when we go to war. I mean, it's true that the mission changed. But the takeaway from the war in Iraq shouldn't be that the problem was that the mission kept changing. The takeaway from the war in Iraq should be the problem was that they lied us into a war where 1 million people died. That's the issue. That they lied us into a war where 1 million Iraqis died, thousands of Americans died, tens of thousands of Americans came home and blew their brains out over what they had seen over there, and it destroyed the country and destabilized the region. That's what was wrong.
If Russia had missiles in Mexico and Canada, the United States government would probably blow them to smithereens, because that's how empires behave. We had the same challenge in Cuba in 1962. So what we end up winning with a criminal invasion. And I know some of my left-wing comrades who know it's an invasion, criminal invasion, but a criminal invasion provoked by the expansion of NATO, which is an instrument of U.S. global power. And we have to be able to conceive of a world when we look at China, when we look at Russia, when we look at Ethiopia, when we look at Haiti, when we look at Brazil, we got to see precious human beings rather than these competitive nation states that are trying to devour more profits, more land, and more territory. Can we conceive of such a world? Can we pursue such a world? I think we have to. What's at stake? The destruction of the species, the destruction of the planet, the destruction of democracies as we know it.
But
so we're cutting against the grain, but always with a smile.
Practically speaking, what would you accept in Ukraine? Like what? I mean, Trump claims he could fix it in 24 hours. What would that look like for you?
What I would do, I would bring in the Chinese, the Turks, the African rulers. I would sit down with the Ukrainian leaders and say, we must stop this war, stop these war crimes, the cluster bombs on a variety of different parties, and make sure that we begin a diplomatic process for a just peace. And that just peace is going to have some serious concessions across the board. Russian troops have to leave. There's going to be debates over the territory. There's going to be some kind of concessions over the territory, but stop the killing. Why? Because the Ukrainian brothers and sisters are precious, and they are bearing so much of the suffering with this proxy war between the American empire and the Russian Federation. So there's responsibility and blame across the board, but the American empire does bear a significant responsibility here, even though there's not the sole or exclusive responsibility, and it's in no way a pro-Putin.
So there is Cornel West, who is he's quite a character. He's a bit of an eccentric fellow, and he is a real leftist. But I gotta say, he's just absolutely right about that. I mean, he is just absolutely correct in what he's saying there, and that is the type of answer I'd like to hear. I don't think it's too much to ask for that somebody actually just blurt out the obvious truth. And it's amazing. And this is, by the way, if for people who have followed me, what got me politically radicalized, what sent me down this path where I've become the psychotic person who you all know and hopefully love, was the Ron Paul Giuliani moment. This was essentially the same, a very similar point to what Ron Paul was making, where it's unbelievable how many people in this country who support the American military machine are just allergic to making a very modest attempt to put the shoe on the other foot and just say, okay, how would we react if someone were doing this to us? How would we feel? Would we take this as some type of provocation, some type of, aggressive act? Imagine Vladimir Putin was expanding his military alliance to Cuba, Mexico, and Canada, and it was encircling the United States of America. Might the American political class have a reaction to that? And as soon as you even start asking that question, the obvious answer is so clear. It's like, oh yeah, they'd go to fucking war over that. Are you out of your mind? And this happened, as he mentioned, in 1962 when the Soviets put nuclear weapons in Cuba. And Jack Kennedy said, and this is largely considered the correct answer by the American people, he was like, that's an act of war. We will go to war with Russia if you don't move those nukes. And then behind the scenes, they negotiated, and the US pulled some missiles back, and Russia pulled those missiles back. What's so crazy about that? The term blowback was it was not coined by left-wing activists like Cornel West. It was not coined by libertarians like Ron Paul. It was a term coined by the CIA. What they defined the term blowback as is they said it was results of U.S. covert policy. So the definition was unintended consequences of covert U.S. policy. And so what happens is you have these covert U.S. policies that then have unintended consequences, also often, engendering hatred against America. And because the policies were covert, when the reaction comes, the American people see it as something just coming out of the clear blue sky. Like, whoa, 9/11, why'd they do that? Why do they hate us? That was the question we all asked after 9/11. Why do they hate us? And the answer that the George W. Bush administration came in to give us was, because we're free. They hate us because we're free. That's it. They're just, freedom makes them so angry. Except the problem is that you have Osama bin Laden's declaration of war against America. You can go read it. You can still find it on the internet. And he's not just saying, we hate you because you're free. He's saying, we hate you because you prop up brutal dictators in the Middle East, because you bomb and kill civilians, because you prop up Israel, because the sanctions in Iraq have been starving babies there. It's like a whole bunch of reasons. Now, there are like these binary thinkers who are only capable, if you say that, of going, so you think Osama bin Laden's good. So you think 9/11 was justified? It's like, no, that's not the claim at all. But let's understand what happened here. And for anybody who actually knows something about the history here, it's ridiculous to argue that there was no provocation of Vladimir Putin. It's not only have we been expanding our military alliance right up to his borders, we've been expanding our military alliance through Eastern Europe for decades. We've been sponsoring color-coded revolutions in Eastern Europe for decades. We backed a coup in 2014 in Ukraine and overthrew a president, a democratically elected president, who was much more favorable to Vladimir Putin than the ones who were installed afterward. Yeah, that might provoke a response. It also led to a civil war in Ukraine from 2014 all the way through Vladimir Putin invading in 2022.
Hi, my name is Ludwig von Mises, and today I will explain what inflation is. In the 16th century, when the gold and silver reserves of America were exploited by colonists, huge amounts of these precious metals were carried to Europe. Since currencies of the time were minted out of these precious metals, there was a general tendency for prices to rise. In the same way, nowadays, when a government increases the amount of money in the economy, all money loses purchasing power, and consequently, prices tend to rise. This phenomenon that I have just described is known as inflation. Unfortunately, some people prefer to see inflation not as an increase in the quantity of money, but as a rise in prices, though that is only one of inflation's effects. This semantic revolution is one of the main features of our day. It tries to change the meaning of inflation, making many people call inflation not the large increase in the money supply, but one of its consequences, the general trend of prices rising. This semantic revolution is far from harmless. It plays an important role in fostering popular trends favouring inflationism. With this revolution, there is no longer a term to designate what the word inflation means. It is then difficult to fight a policy that has no name. Statesmen and writers are no longer able to use a term that the general public understands and relates to the problem of issuing large additional amounts of currency. Another drawback is that many inflationists say they fight inflation when in fact they promote it. You see, if inflation is the rise in prices, a layman can be convinced that the fault is with greed and opportunism, that of businessmen who want ever greater profits. But if inflation is the massive expansion of the money supply, then the blame lies with governments and their respective central banks for abusing their monopoly over currency. It is not uncommon to see politicians and even economists arguing that there is no relationship between monetary expansion and the general increase in prices. Now, under current technological conditions, nothing would be easier than making scraps of paper and printing some monetary figures on them. In the United States, for example, where all bills are of the same size, printing a $1,000 bill would cost the government no more than printing a $1 bill. Well, let's travel back in time and go back to the 18th century, when the first attempts were made to issue banknotes and assign them the status of currency. Many governments believed that bankers had some magic formula that allowed them to create wealth out of thin air. A few years before the French Revolution, when France was in financial trouble, the king sought out one of these ingenious bankers and appointed him to an important position. And so Monsieur Necker, famous Madame de Staël's father, became France's finance minister, and everyone expected him to solve the country's financial problems. At the time, Necker decided to send money to the colonists of America to help them in the War of Independence against England, but he did so without raising taxes. Seen from today, that was certainly the wrong way to try to solve problems.
The Peter Schiff Show.
The bond market rose a bit and yields came down on the back of the better than expected inflation numbers. But again, anybody looking at these numbers is looking in the rear view mirror. They need to look forward at the weakness of the dollar and the impact that's going to have on prices, import prices, energy prices, everything, and how that's going to affect future CPI increases. The markets, again, haven't figured this out. I think if you look at where the dollar is right now, we could fall very quickly from where we are down to about 90. And that's a 10% drop. That still wouldn't erase 100% of the dollar's rise since January of 2021, but it would erase most of it. And I think that's going to be an initial support area for the dollar. And I probably think that the markets won't be particularly concerned about the dollar as long as we're above that 90 level. But I think once we crack it, you're going to see some type of panic setting in the bond market or in the foreign exchange market. And if it doesn't happen at 90, there will be a breaking point somewhere along the way. Remember, the record low for the dollar was just above 70 back in 2008 before it was saved, ironically, by the financial crisis. The next crisis is really a currency crisis, US dollar crisis. I don't know if it's going to take a break to all-time record lows to precipitate that crisis, but if that's what it's going to take, that's what it's going to happen, because the dollar is going to take out that low. Either that's going to happen and cause the crisis, or that's going to happen as a result of the crisis. But one way or another, we're getting the crisis. Now, the gold market should smell that out well in advance. And I think gold will start hitting new highs before the dollar hits new lows. But he said that this ETF was going to do for Bitcoin what the gold ETF did for gold, because he said the cost of trading Bitcoin on your own is absurd. It's so expensive and so cumbersome to actually buy crypto that they're doing everybody a favor by creating this ETF that now lets everybody buy crypto who couldn't buy it before, which is nonsense. The whole value proposition for Bitcoin or other crypto is that it eliminates the need for a third party. It eliminates the precise ETF that Larry Fink is creating that he thinks adds value to Bitcoin. If he's going to argue that Bitcoin is too expensive and too cumbersome to actually trade, and therefore you need an ETF, he's just undermined the main value proposition of Bitcoin itself. And so if Bitcoin doesn't have any value until you put it into an ETF, then what exactly are you putting into that ETF that has value? You're putting nothing. The whole argument is absurd because it contradicts itself. You know, this ETF is going to have a custody fee. There is no custody fee to store your own Bitcoin. So why the hell do you need to pay Blackstone money to store something that you could just as easily store yourself for free? Look, he does not believe in Bitcoin or crypto or anything else. He's motivated by a desire to make some money off this ETF. And that's the reason he's flipped. Just like Kevin O'Leary got paid by Bankman-Fried a bunch of money to go out and pump FTX, even though he didn't even believe in it. That's what's going on with Larry Fink. This guy is laughing all the way to the bank. He's out there saying that he has no interest in owning himself. He doesn't believe in. He's just trying to make a buck. This is what Wall Street does. This is the history of Wall Street. They care about themselves, right? That's their main mission. And they've been protected by the SEC. They've been protected by FINRA. You know, people think, oh, you know, these guys are all government regulated, so they must be, you know, they must be okay. You know, there's a watchdog there to make sure they don't rip me off. No, you got to be your own watchdog. The government is not going to help you. The SEC was started about 90 years ago. It was an overreaction to the Great Depression. We would be much better off today if we didn't have an SEC, but we do thanks to what the government did, right? Because the government never lets a crisis go to waste. So the stock market crashes, and so the government uses that crash to get more power over the markets. And so the original intent of the SEC, and in fact, the law today, it's still there to protect the public, to protect the small investor from Wall Street, right? Because small investors got hurt during the crash. And so the government said, oh, okay, so we need government to protect people so they don't get hurt. Of course, the best protection for the public is a free market. It's not because we didn't have enough regulation that people lost money during the 1929 crash. We've had many crashes since then with the SEC, and people have lost a lot of money. So the SEC didn't stop market crashes. The SEC didn't stop people from losing money. In fact, I'm sure a lot more people have lost a lot more money because of the SEC. And so we shouldn't have it. But anyway, the SEC came after him and some other people, and they said, you're buying and selling stocks for a living. You need to be registered, or you should have been registered as a broker dealer, but you weren't a broker dealer. And so we're suing you for buying and selling stocks and not being a broker dealer. But they were buying and selling stocks for their own account. They had no customers. Broker dealers are supposed to deal with customers, not for themselves. And so he makes this point, and he actually lost. The SEC won a summary judgment in the lower court. And the court actually ruled that Keener met the definition of a dealer, quote, because he operated a regular business of buying and selling securities for his own account. But that's not the definition. If you go to the SEC's website today, they exempt people trading for their own account. It's meant to protect customers. So if you are buying and selling stocks on behalf of other people and you're charging those other people a commission, then you need to be registered as a dealer. If you're just making investments for yourself, doesn't matter if that's your source of living. If you do that and you don't have another job, if that's the only thing you do is buy and sell securities for yourself, you're not a dealer. But now, according to the lower court, you are a dealer. Now, the SEC wants Keener to disgorge all the profits he made doing this, plus interest, plus penalties. It's more than a $10 million judgment. You know, initially, they wanted to ignore the losers and cherry pick the winners. They were able to at least get them to give credit for the money he lost, right? So he didn't just pay taxes They don't just want back the gains, it's the net. But still, you pay income taxes on the gains. You don't get the income tax back. So the government actually ends up making a lot more than the individual investor, because he has to pay back all of his profits, but he's already paid taxes on those profits to the IRS. You can't get those back. You can't write off the fine. Then the SEC wants prejudgment interest. They want over $1 million in penalties. And you have a lot of other people in the security industry that are interested in this case that have filed, amicus briefs on behalf of Keener or others, because what the government is doing here is they're trying to get the camel's nose under the tent. Right now, they're focusing on a narrow subset of traders. These are people who were trading in convertible debt. But if they can say that these traders are dealers and need to register, then everybody, not just a mutual fund, an insurance company, a hedge fund, a pension fund, but everybody who just trades stock on a Robinhood app, if that's your primary source of income, maybe you're retired or all you are is a day trader and you're just trading for yourself, according to this, you now need to be registered as a broker-dealer. This is how the government usurps power. It's up to the courts to rein in government when they're going beyond their statutory or constitutional authority. And that is clearly what the SEC is doing by going after these guys. So what that means is nobody is going to pay $37,000 if they can borrow $37,000 and just pay back $25,000 with no interest over 10 years. So the government encourages people who might otherwise have paid for college to borrow the money instead, because they're not going to have to pay it back. But what's even more significant is when you have these income qualifications, no more than 5% of your income, you're kind of indifferent between borrowing $37,000 or borrowing $100,000 or $200,000, because regardless, your payments, your monthly payments are the same. The colleges know this. They take advantage of this by jacking up tuitions even farther. Tuition has skyrocketed since Obama came in and took over the student loans, which is exactly what I predicted. Every time the government makes it easier for people not to repay their student loans, to pay back less than they owe, the result of that is that student loan debt grows even faster. College tuitions rise even higher. That's why we have better than $1.81 trillion of student debt. It's because of what the government is doing. And based on what the Biden administration just did, right, this is a green light for more debt, higher tuition. And so we're going to hit $3 trillion in college debt a lot sooner as a result of what the Biden administration is doing.
What I want to demonstrate is that there is no magic formula. If the government needs money, it has to obtain it by imposing taxes on its citizens, or by borrowing money. But most governments think that there is another, magical method of obtaining the necessary money, which is simply to print it. If the government wants to do something beneficial, build a hospital for example, the government's means for raising the required money is to collect taxes from the citizens, and build the hospital with the amount thus acquired. In that case, there will be no increase in prices, because when the government raises money for the construction of the hospital, the citizens, burdened by this tax, are forced to reduce their spending. And in that case, the amount of money in circulation is not increased. Of course, the government won't buy exactly the same goods that the citizens would buy, but the point is that, on average, there is no rise in prices as a result of the construction of the hospital by the government. I chose the example of a hospital precisely because it is so common to hear that inflation is only bad when it is used for bad ends. So let's assume that the government always uses the new money it has issued for the best possible purposes. It turns out that the issue is not how the money is spent, it is how it is obtained by the government. For example, the government could use the money raised through taxes to hire new employees, or to raise the salaries of those already in its service. These employees, having had an increase in their salaries, are then able to buy more. When the government collects taxes from citizens and applies this sum to increase the salaries of its staff, taxpayers will have less to spend, but public servants will have more. In this case, the trend for prices to rise will not occur. But if the government prefers to substantially expand the money supply, that is, printing a lot of new money, or simply typing numbers in the bank accounts of people through easy and cheap credit, as it happens nowadays with the advent of technology, then some people will start to have more money, while everyone else still has as much as before. Thus, those who receive the newly printed money will compete with those who were previously buyers. And since there are no more goods than before, but there are more units of money in the market, and since there are people who can buy more now than yesterday, there will be an additional demand for an unchanged quantity of goods. Therefore, prices will tend to rise. But it is important to point out that the upward trend in prices will be established step by step, since it is not the famous price level. When we speak of price level, the image that people form in their minds is that of a liquid that rises or falls according to the increase or decrease in its quantity, but which, like a liquid in a reservoir, always rises evenly. But with prices, there is no such thing as evenly. As an effect that became known as the Cantillon effect explains, prices do not change to the same extent, much less immediately after monetary expansion. There are always prices that change faster, fall or rise faster than others, and there's a reason for that. People do not all precisely buy the same goods in the same quantities on the same day. The extra money that the government printed and spent is not used to purchase all goods and services evenly. It is used in the purchase of certain commodities, the prices of which will rise, while others will still remain at the prices held before the new money was introduced into the market.
And May, they did the shaping operations, they did the probing attacks, which is all necessary, and then they launched full on probably the 4th or 5th of June, depending on how you want to count it, when they actually began full scale. But you don't do shaping operations a month after you start. And furthermore, as you've seen in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, they've all had extensive detail from aerial photographs, from satellite photographs. We know exactly where the Russian positions are. And I mean, to the detail that's, I think, unprecedented military history that just common people have access to, precise, geolocated positions of wherever pillboxes, et cetera. You don't need to do very many probing attacks to know where it is. It's right there. So that's just nonsense on every level. They're just trying to cover over for the complete lack of success. And while part of me gets that, they don't want to admit failure, but the consequence to not admitting failure is to continue to reinforcing negative outcomes and just sending their troops into slaughter. And that is unconscionable to me.
It's Anti-War Radio. Scott Horton here talking with Daniel Davis. Now, the War Party says, and I know you see this even at 1945 where you write, and of course all over Twitter and whatever, they say, well, yeah, that's because of the stab in the back. A bunch of liberal namby-pambies like you said that it's not okay to give them the tanks and the F-16s and the long-range rocket artillery that they need, and we've been piecemealing it out and taking way too long, and if only we had quadrupled down on our support for Ukraine a year ago, they would have won this war, Danny.
Well, they have a partial agreement, or criticism is valid with that, in that we did just dribble stuff out left and right. Look, if we were going to not do something, we should have just not done it. But if we're going to do it, then why wait 6, 12 months, into this thing, 15 to 18 months, whatever, things keep dribbling out. But the fact is that any analysis would have shown that if you had done all the stuff up front immediately, Ukraine didn't have the army to be able to handle this. On the first day of the war, Ukraine had about 250,000 active duty troops. You couldn't have given them multiple brigades worth of equipment because they wouldn't have even known how to use it. So it wouldn't have worked if you gave it to them right away. Trying to give it to them later in some sense was necessary because you had to train people up. But of course, all the time you're doing this train up, you're also losing people by the hundreds every single day. Now, these people that you trained, a lot of these Western trained in NATO countries that they put in there have already died. And they died really quickly, especially in the 47th and 33rd Brigades. They were the spearhead of this offensive, and they just ran into an absolute buzzsaw on the first days and again last night. And so you see everywhere that we have used these trained NATO equipment, trained NATO troops, they go in there, what happens? They just get chewed up in a buzzsaw. So it didn't matter if you had them early, late, or medium. It's not going to change the outcome because of the capacity of the Russian side, which is on graphic display, especially in their defensive. Now, whether Russia can convert that into an offensive here this summer is still an open question, but their defensive capacity and their skill set and their industrial capacity and their ability to build defenses is absolutely beyond question.
How much support could we have given them, and would it have worked, or it would have just proverbially ended up in the hands of the Taliban?
No, that one was the case because of the fundamentals that existed there, in that the more you put, the more resistance you would have generated, because that's where most of it came from. The more you see over time, the more troops we put in Afghanistan, the more violence there was because we went into areas where we weren't before. And all it does is engender expected and predictable resistance. And then we saw how that worked out for the very reasons that we suggested back in those years ago. The same thing exists here for somewhat different reasons there. Like I said, if you had given all those troops and all those weapons and everything that they wanted on day one, number one, they didn't have the capacity to use it. So it was not even possible back then. You can't just give them F-16s when they don't have any training for that, for example. You can't give them a bunch of tanks when they have no training on it. All those things take months of time, in the very least, to do. They didn't have months of time, so that wouldn't have worked. And you couldn't have done it before. You could just say, okay, well, we're going to give it to them in like 2021. That would have sparked war itself. Russia would have invaded earlier, recognizing the obvious threat. In the event that you triple down now and you say, okay, we're going to give them F-16s, long-range weapon systems, maybe send, some, what do they call them? Some volunteers from a bunch of, tens of thousands, and suddenly there's thousands of other troops that are going in there from Western countries, so-called volunteers. Even that's not going to work, because the worst case scenario that it succeeds, or the best case in some few people's minds, and let's say that they actually get to the Azov coast and they cut the land bridge off to Crimea and all that stuff. What do you think is going to happen? Is Russia going to go, darn it, dang it, you finally got it, all right, we're going home? Of course not. that before they ever get to the coast, if it was clear they were going to make that move, nuclear weapons come out. There is zero chance, in my view, Scott, not even unlikely, but zero chance that Putin would ever allow his forces to be driven out of Ukraine and not resort to the tactical nuclear weapons. They've been very clear about that all the way through, that if their territory integrity is threatened, that their viability is threatened, they will use them unambiguously. And we would do the same in the reverse, which is why that has held, that mutual deterrence has held. But if they succeeded in what these people say they want to do and win on the battlefield, all you're going to do is spark nuclear escalation, and everything is on the table then that it could be disaster for mankind. If people got their way and the Azov Coast was cut, then the chances of nuclear war go through the roof. And how's that in anybody's benefit in the West or in the world? It's not. So every way you look at it, we don't benefit by this war continuing on. Ukraine is not going to win it, because if they start to, Russia brings out their trump card. And I don't understand why people don't get that.
Hang on just one second for me. You guys know that I consider the Defend the Guard movement, led by the combat vets at BringOurTroopsHome.us and DefendTheGuard.us, to be the most important thing happening in American politics today. Simply put, this law would nullify the empire by preventing the state governors from handing their National Guard troops over to the president for foreign combat without an official declaration of war from the Congress. We've made great progress getting it out of committee and even passed the state Senate in Arizona. Help support Bring Our Troops Home and Defend the Guard at BringOurTroopsHome.us and DefendTheGuard.us. And you know what? I mean, all right, it's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Daniel L. Davis. And doesn't it come down to, Danny, the counterpoint that is the consensus in Washington, D.C. is because Chamberlain and Hitler at Munich.
You are getting me riled up here. That is one of the things I jump on the most, because it is absolute and complete nonsense to even suggest that Russia has the capacity to move 1 inch beyond the Ukraine into any NATO territory. Look, we've had 17 months of all-out warfare by Russia, and they are still stuck at 17 or 18% of the one country on their border that has no mutual defense alliances with anyone. The idea that they could go 1 inch into a 31 and almost 32 member NATO alliance with conventional power is absurd. The Russians cannot move into Ukraine, into NATO territory. They don't have the capacity to project power that far. They are limited right now, Scott. Here's the Achilles heel. Russia is limited to about 180 kilometers beyond their forward lines at any time to project power. That's all they can do. Their system is physically incapable of doing more than that. So that means they can't push into Western Europe because they don't have the capacity. They physically don't have the ability to do it. So it doesn't matter what they want to do, what people think they want to do, what they're afraid. They can't make good on that threat. So that is a straw man that doesn't even exist.
So when inflation starts, different groups of the population get affected in different ways. The groups who first receive the new money gain an advantage over those that receive the new money last, when prices have gone higher. Let's illustrate this with an example. Suppose the government issues substantial amounts of money to pay for a war, and with that new currency it buys ammunition. The first to receive the additional money then are the ammunition industries and those who work for them. They end up earning higher profits and earning higher wages because their businesses flourish. Why is that? Because they were the first to receive the additional money. And now, having more money in their hands, they can buy more. And they buy from other people who manufacture and sell the goods they demand. These other people constitute a second group benefiting from the new money now received. And this second group too considers inflation to be very beneficial for their business. Why not? Isn't it splendid to sell more? And the owner of a restaurant located in the surroundings of a munitions factory, for example, says, "It's really wonderful. Ammunition workers have more money. They're coming to my establishment like never before. They're all supporting my restaurant. This makes me very happy." The situation is as follows. Those groups to whom money arrives first have their purchasing power increased and can continue to buy many goods and services at prices that match with the previous state of the market, at the situation prevailing on the eve of inflation. But there are other groups of the population for whom this money arrives much later. These people find themselves in an unfavourable situation. Before they have access to the additional money, prices have already risen, and they are obliged to pay higher prices than previously for some commodities they wish to acquire, or practically all of them, while their earnings remain the same, or do not increase proportionally to the prices. At each moment, therefore, those groups directly affected by inflation are all different. For some of them, inflation is not that bad, and they even defend its extension. Here comes the resulting issue. Governments tend to prefer inflation to increasing taxes. Increasing taxes is an extremely unpopular measure. We have had revolutions that started due to an increase in taxes.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Chapter 1 is one of the most satisfying things I've ever written. You will understand the United States and its nature better than anybody you know, and so therefore you'll understand why it's not quote-unquote treason to favor secession or even lesser measures like nullification. It is not treason. It is a natural expression of the proper American spirit, if anything. And there are so many questions, so many objections. Well, what about this? How would you solve that? How do you account for this? It's all in there. And you know what the best part of it is? You get this thing for free. How about that? I'm giving that away to you for free. And you know where I'm giving it to you? At nationaldivorce.com.
Yeah, so what interests me is that with all the divisions that we have in American politics and in American constitutional law over things like living constitutionalism versus originalism, we don't have much division when it comes to these true moral pillars that I've identified. And it's not coming directly from Brown, but indirectly through what I call the canonization of Brown. And those true moral pillars are that diversity is a constitutional good. And that means that anything that conflicts with the promotion of diversity must be, if not resisted, perhaps even eliminated. And also, in addition, that discrimination, even if it is private discrimination, is a constitutional evil, which likewise must be eliminated no matter the cost.
Maybe we might add a third principle to this, that it's not expressly to be found in Brown. And by the way, a lot of these things are not expressly to be found there, but if you pull it apart and you keep building on it, you can insert them. But this third one might be the doctrine of disparate impact, that even if you're doing something that on the face of it doesn't appear to have discriminatory intent, that doesn't matter if it has discriminatory outcome in the sense that it affects different races differently. And so you can see that in some of the ways that the Brown decision was ultimately enforced, in that freedom of choice plans were set aside because they didn't have the right outcomes. The outcomes were still disparate. And so you can see that Heather McDonald in her recent book really emphasizes the role of disparate impact in spreading beyond the legal order into just every aspect of society, into symphony orchestras and whatever. Anything we do is held to this disparate impact standard. So maybe we might say that's also part of it.
And that is, of course, the real problem that I have. It's not the Brown decision itself, which in many ways is a favor. It is the fact that we cannot have honest conversations on what is happening to our constitutional system.
No, it's true. And that's in large part because, I mean, you can say, well, conservatives had no other choice, right? There's a cultural shift going on in the country. Nobody's going to be patient enough to listen to constitutional arguments when their heartstrings are being pulled on. I mean, I hear all that. But what conservatives seem to be very good at doing is they come to accept things that they once rejected. And that thing they once rejected is actually the foundation of the very order that is currently strangling them. They accept the foundation, and then they spend their time wringing their hands over what are obviously the inevitable consequences of the very thing they're now celebrating. And so if we're not going to have the conversation about the consequences of this thing, I mean, all we do is talk about the consequences. We don't talk about the thing that led to the consequences. And that's what you're trying to do here.
Yeah, and I think you could see that. I mean, in various areas of play. I mean, you could see what anti-discrimination law is doing across the country in terms of the gay rights agenda, transgender rights, and so on. That once we accept that discrimination is the worst thing that could ever happen to a person, we are creating the system that we live in now, where, you know, in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, of course, that couple could have gone to another baker to get their cake, but they feel constitutionally entitled, not just morally or psychologically entitled, constitutionally entitled to mandate that this baker bake their cake for their wedding because that's what they demand. And that is, of course, the culture coming out of Brown, whereby even a sole proprietor, small baker, he is essentially a state actor with a constitutional power because feelings of inferiority or feelings of discrimination have now been given a constitutional status.
Well, that's the thing. I did an analysis of one of the cases involving in fact, I think it might have been that one, the Jack Phillips case. And it's so interesting because they've accepted this set of premises. Well, for example, you point out that it's quite normal and understandable why a liberal like Kagan on the court would say to Jack Phillips's legal team, well, okay, but if this was a cake celebrating, let's say, black people or something, surely you wouldn't be in here saying that he has the right to do that. And they're all saying, oh, you're right, of course he wouldn't. That would be completely different. And Kagan, who I don't think is that bright, asks the correct follow-up question. Okay, so what, are you just saying race is somehow different? Like, I mean, that's the correct answer to ask. If you're going to accept this set of ideas, then it doesn't make sense for you to say, well, we can do whatever we want with regard to cakes if it has to do with homosexuality, but if it has to do with anything else, then that's another matter. None of that makes sense. So again, the root of the problem is this initial set of premises. Because when you read the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision, it is unbelievable the hoops they have to jump through to come to the conclusion this guy does not have to bake this cake. It is unbelievable. They have to go through a history of cakes and the significance of whether there's a frosted message on them. And it's insane because how else can they argue the case, given that they've tied both hands behind their backs?
There is something to say about it. And if you think the opinions themselves have that quality. You should listen to the oral arguments, which I do discuss toward the end of the essay. The oral arguments are so revealing of what this canonization of Brown has created, in that the justices are constantly coming back to the question of, if you're allowed to discriminate against this gay couple, what about the interracial couple and so on? And it's really revealing how obsessed with race the justices are. There's something I imagine kind of annoying for the litigants who have these facts that have nothing to do with race. It's one white baker discriminating against two white gay guys, not about race at all. And yet the justices keep talking about race. And there's also something quite frustrating and revealing that when someone like Kagan, I think Sotomayor pushes this point quite a bit too in the oral arguments, well, why is race discrimination not going to be permitted, but gay discrimination is? There is not a rational answer that any of these really smart justices could come up with. And you will see the justices be able to really push these lawyers in ways that you don't see oftentimes. These lawyers are highly trained and are prepared for these questions. But that is a question that just nobody can answer. And you'll see the Solicitor General, for example, just saying, well, race is just different, because there is not an answer for why discrimination against this one group would be constitutionally prohibited but not forbidden.
On the other hand, inflation, more hidden, is not that unpopular. Yet, of course, most politicians are not going to say, I will adopt inflation as a method. The technical procedures used to produce inflation are very complex, which makes the common citizen, with too little time to delve into the topic, not realise that inflation has started. It is not easy to simplify such complex topics, and I certainly wouldn't have written huge works on this topic if they were as simple as they seem to be. But fundamentals are precisely these. If the amount of money in circulation increases while other things remain the same, the value of money falls. Well, let's go back in time again and look at one of the biggest inflations of all history, the one that took place in the German Reich after the First World War and that reached its peak in the post-war period. The government, as expected, did not announce anything, it simply made the central bank print more money. Ultimately, great inflation ends with the collapse of the currency, giving rise to a catastrophe, a situation like that which occurred in Germany in 1923. On the 1st of August 1914, $1 was at par with 4 marks and 20 pfennigs. 9 years and 3 months later, in November 1923, $1 was quoted at a staggering 4.2 trillion marks. In other words, the mark was no longer worth anything. Some say at the end of the day we're all dead. I'm sorry to confirm that they are correct. But the question is, how long will the present moment last? In the 18th century there was a famous lady, Madame de Pompadour, to whom the following saying is assigned: Après nous, le déluge. After us, the flood. Madame de Pompadour died shortly afterwards, but her successor, Madame du Barry, survived a little longer, only enough to be beheaded. For many, the long run soon becomes the present, and the more inflation advances, the more the long run is faced as unanticipated. Let us return to the case of Germany, which the whole world witnessed. Many books have described the events of that period, and I have seen with my own eyes a similar situation in my country, Austria. For many years, the German people believed that their inflation was nothing more than a temporary situation, which would soon end. As the inflation continued, however, the population thought it wiser to buy everything that was for sale, anything, instead of keeping the money in their pockets. Furthermore, people reasoned that it was not convenient to lend money, to be a creditor. On the other hand, it was excellent business to borrow money, to be in debt. Debt would buy you anything in those times. Thus, inflation continued to feed on itself. Inflation continued in Germany until the autumn of 1923. At that time, the country's factories paid their workers every morning, 1 day in advance. And the worker, who was accompanied by his wife to the factory, immediately gave her his earnings of the day, all the millions he had just received. She would then promptly go to a store to buy anything. She saw what most people knew at the time. The mark lost, overnight, an incredible 50% of its purchasing power. Money melted in people's pockets, like a chocolate bar over a hot oven. This final phase of German inflation did not last long. After a few days, the whole nightmare was over. The mark had lost all value, and a new currency had to be established. We must remember that, in the end, we may all be dead. In fact, there is no doubt that we will all be dead. But we should take care of our earthly affairs, during this brief interval in which we are allowed to live, the best we can. And one of the measures necessary for this purpose is to abandon inflationary policies.